Alright, so hey there, my name's Ben Engel. I work over at Lost Coast Outfitters, and we're going to be tying the surf scrimp today. It is a mole crab, shrimp imitation that should work for any of your beach-going species or any of your flats fish. It's tied on a 60-degree Gamakatsu jig hook, which is extremely strong for the weight of the wire that we're using, so I really like I just love this hook for any kind of jigged fly. I picked this one up from Steve Adachi, so you know it's good if Steve's using it. So I'm using 140 denier thread. This is Vivus, but realistically you can use any kind of thread that suits the fly you're tying. I like the hot orange just because these mole crabs and shrimp develop a little bit of an orange glow from those eggs as they go into the spawn. We were out at Stinson yesterday and noticed that, and it's pretty bright, so anytime you can throw a little bit of orange into a fly, I think it's a good idea for the surf. So I'm throwing on some orange intruder eyes, and I'm just going to X-wrap these on, but I find that a lot of people try to do one wrap in one direction, then one wrap in another direction, and it ends up never really getting that tight on the hook. So I like to actually get 4 or 5 wraps in one direction and then tweak it with my fingers by actually forcing that eye back into place and going back in with thread wraps in that opposite direction. And what that's going to do is that's just going to tighten those wraps as you go. Then to really lock them in, I'm going to go underneath those eyes but over the hook and just kind of suck all of those thread wraps in. Now, at this point, generally I'll be tying 3 or 4 of these things at a time just because it's more economical when you're using the brushes to work that way. I find that anytime you try and save any of that brush material, it ends up getting all crazy and not as easy to use as when it comes straight out of the package. But it also benefits you because what we're going to do is we're going to super glue the eyes at this point. I hate tying over fresh super glue because I end up gluing my fingers to something and then I got to rip them off. So this way we can pre-glue a couple flies and get them all set and set them off aside. And then when the time is ready to start putting the actual materials on the hook, you have a nice secure eye that's not going to move around the hook shank on you, and you're not going to be gluing yourself to your fly. So I'll go ahead and I'll grab another one of my hooks from the cup that I'm setting on for, this one's already pre-done, so I can go back in and start securing some materials. So back to that same orange thread, that Vivus 140. I'm going to run that all the way back down the hook shank and get just a nice even layer of thread. Don't spend too much time on trying to make it perfect. We're going to be covering this up with a lot of material, so you don't need to worry about it being perfect touching thread turns like a soft hackle or something like that. So you're going to notice that I'm actually going to go a little bit around the bend of the hook. This is so that that little bit of the feelers of the shrimp orient in an upward direction. It just helps with the taper of the fly in the end. Remove my waste piece, and I've advanced my thread again kind of to that center point on the hook. At this point I'm going to grab my lower color of EP fibers. You'll notice that I put a zip tie around my EP fiber. It just helps to keep it a little bit more manageable. If you don't do that step, the bags just end up going crazy on you. So this one we're using a tan EP fiber. And this is the original. Alright, so I'm going to cut off around a matchstick. That's the way that EP flies, or 239 flies always talks about it, is around a matchstick. But I find that the sparser the better with this stuff. It's really hard to put too little of this material, but it's very easy to put too much. So I'm going to measure out around a hook shank of length, maybe a hook shank and a half because I'm going to wrap it backwards, and then I'm going to double that over. So I'll go ahead, cut that to length, get my thread right in front of that point, secure right in the middle, and then I'm just going to grab that, fold it backwards, And I'm going to wrap that, trying to keep it oriented on the top of the shank of the hook all the way to just around the bend where we stopped our thread earlier. And then I'll bring my thread back up to get prepped for the next little section. One of the things that you can do with this stuff is, rather than trying to forcefully cut it, if you just kind of let the scissors do the work, it'll taper it a lot easier. You can kind of just move down that fly. So that looks pretty good. And you'll notice that it is giving you that upwards presentation, which is what we're looking for. Next fiber I'm going to go in with is a little bit of the orange EP, and we're going to repeat the same process, but on this time you'll notice that I flip my hook over. We're going to again keep it on the top so that it stays clean of that tan that we just tied in. So I'll grab a little bit of that orange EP. Again, that matchstick is what you're looking for. And I try to think of it as a matchstick when it's not compressed. When it's compressed, it should be around the thickness of angel hair pasta. Alright, so for this one, just to introduce a little bit of taper so we don't have to do as much work for cutting, I'm going to go ahead and just kind of peel those fibers out, just starting to introduce a little bit of a taper. And then once I have that, I'm going to go ahead and grab that, pinch, and pull that through so that I have an equal taper on the other side. Find that halfway point, put that right on top of the hook, and I'm going to keep one of those sections, because I have it in half, one of those sections is going to come on the near side of the bend of the hook, and then I'll fold the other side around the bend of the hook so that there's no fibers that are going to interfere with that. It'll keep it from fouling. Again, this is a technique that Steve Adachi uses on his clousers. We find that with these synthetic fibers, they want to foul. They unfortunately don't want to keep separate, so any little bit that you can do in tying your flies to avoid that and avoid having to comb them out every 15 casts in the water is going to be very, very crucial. So I'm just going to keep that right on the top of the hook. I'll actually flip it over just because I find it's easier to pinch there. And you'll notice that that is going to sit right on top. And we'll start to, again, just kind of roll it in your fingers, check the taper, see how bad it looks. Sometimes you'll get it perfect, most of the time you won't. Most of the time you're going to need a little bit of trimming done on that fly, and just take your time. Unless you got some water to be on, there's no rush to fly tying. Alright, next, this is an optional step, but I do find that it just makes the fly look a little better. It's one of the things that you see on a lot of synthetic flies, a lot of saltwater flies, is I'm just going to add some barring to that tail. So I'm going to go in with either a Sharpie, or I'm using a Copic sketch marker here. And rather than going with something like black, I find that browns and grays, you can even do orange barring through this fly, are going to look a lot better. I find that black just looks really harsh on the fly. Alright, so we talked a little bit about orange and that egg sac that these mole crabs and shrimp develop as they're going into the spawn. What I'm going to do for that, and this is actually going to help to keep my eyes separate, is go in with a little bit of this cool material from Hairline called Ice Dub chenille. I used to use just regular chenille, but this has a little bit more flash to it. It does the same exact trick as regular chenille, so more flash the better out in the surf. We really want any light to reflect back at those fish so that they can key in on that opportunistic eat. So I'll wrap that back. And then one of the tricks that I picked up with this stuff is that if you just do 2 wraps right in front of themselves, you're never really going to get a perfect ball. But what you can do is actually, after you make that second wrap, I'm going to take the core of the chenille and center it between those 2 wraps that I just made, and then bring it back to the front as I go around the shank, and that's going to give me a perfect little dubbing ball every single time. That perfect sphere is going to help to splay those eyes and keep them from fouling. So I can go in and I can cut my waist. You'll notice that with my offhand I always push my bobbin out of the way when I'm cutting stuff. I won't say that I never cut my thread, but it definitely helps to avoid that, and there's nothing worse than cutting your thread when you're tying a fly and having to restart it and hoping things don't unravel on you. At this point, I'm going to go with the Enrico Puglisi eyes. I have them in this bag in the amber and the black. Those are probably my two favorite colors that they come in. For this one, we're going to go ahead and use black. I like to have the nice contrast, but the amber eyes can give a more natural look if you're trying to make something for permit or any pickier fish on the flats. I don't find that the fish that I target very often, like perch or striped bass, are that picky when it comes to flies, so I like to make them stand out. But from what I've heard in the permit game and maybe even the Corbina game, anything that really stands out can hurt you. So sometimes going with something a little more subtle like those amber eyes can help to get those fish to eat. So I'm going to position that eye just in between the first and second bar that I made on that tail. If you don't make the bars on the tail, just have it go about a third of the way into that section. I'll wrap that forward, and I'll go ahead and I'll cut around halfway. We want to introduce a little bit of a taper to our thread body as we're moving forward and we're wrapping in these materials. So by cutting your materials at a certain length along the hook shank, you can start to introduce that taper from the very beginning of the fly and not have to worry about cleaning it up as much as we finish the pattern. Alright, so now my eyes are secure. At this point I'm going to add some antenna, and for that I'm just going to use pearl flashabou, one strand, and I'm going to fold it in half and actually get both sides of this fly. So I'll just select one strand, and you can use whatever color flashabou you like. For the lighter ones on this one, I really like the pearl. For my darker patterns, like the olive ones, I actually like using a material called holographic flashabou. It throws a little bit more light, gives a little bit more contrast from that darker pattern. But for the light ones, I tend to like just going with the simple pearl. So I caught that in on the top of the hook, and I folded one side back on the near side and one side on the far side. And I'm just going to wrap those back and try to steer clear of your point on this hook. Try not to catch your thread and get them situated, and don't worry about cutting them yet. I find that anytime you can avoid using your scissors in the fly tying process, you run less risk of cutting thread or materials that you didn't want to cut. So I'm going to go ahead and just trim all of this up when I'm done with the fly. Next we're going to go with a material called UV polar chenille. And this one I'm using the orange, but comes in a bunch of awesome colors. You can kind of mess around with this pattern and tie it to suit your needs. I've been thinking about tying them in some dark burgundies and reds to imitate crawfish and fish on some of our California, maybe all over the Delta, as well as like rivers like the Truckee, in targeting bigger fish with streamers. So I'm going to take about 3 wraps of this stuff, but what I'm going to do is after I get that third wrap secured and tied in, I'm actually going to tie back over this material just to get it to condense out of one spot as opposed to taking up so much space on the bend of the hook. So there's my 3 turns. I'll catch that under. Don't worry about it being neat. If you catch some fibers, it's not going to kill the fly. We're actually going to grab everything and bend it backwards to tidy up. So turn that, grab everything with your left hand, pinch, and just wrap a little bit over those fibers just to condense them. Alright, next we're going to go with our rubber legs. On these ones, I'm using the Hot Tip Crazy Legs from Hairline. I really like these pink ones with the orange tips. I find that they just really glow in the water regardless of clarity. So I'll peel off 2 of those legs from the hank, and then I'm going to grab both of the tips in one hand. So that'll allow me to cut and get a perfect cut right down the center of those legs. Pull tight, cut. So now you have 2 sets of connected legs that are perfectly even. Does it matter if they're even? Probably not, but it makes your flies look a little better. So I'm going to catch one set of those legs on the near side of my hook, and what I'll do is tilt this on axis so you can see this, but if I pull out at a 45-degree angle while I'm tying those in, it's just going to help to make sure that they stay right on the side of that fly, and that's where you want them. You don't want them to really stick on the bottom. You want them to stay right on the side. And then I'll go in with some tighter turns and just secure them in and make sure they don't move. Then I'll repeat the same for the other side. Just find where you tied in the last ones because they're both even, and then wrap those forwards or backwards. Yep. And that'll happen. Sometimes your legs will break on you. Don't worry about it, just grab another pair. That's why you don't want to pull too tight on these as you're wrapping backwards. You want to make sure that you have loose turns with those legs. And then as you move back forward, you can secure them in with tighter thread wraps. But the thread will sometimes cut this material, so I'll grab that other set. And just keep those right on the side of the hook and wrap them backwards. And we'll go in and we'll secure everything. All right. And again, I'm not going to worry about cutting those until the very end of the fly. Next, we're going to go in with a medium Palmer chenille. This one's in orange. My 2 favorite colors of this stuff are probably tan and this orange. They tend to be the most versatile for just about everything you're doing. Really, really cool material. And this is just going to give us a little bit more texture to the back of this fly. That first chenille that we tied in was a very long fibered chenille. This one's going to be a little shorter, so it's going to help to give that movement in the back. Anytime you have taper, it gives you more movement, so it's a good thing. And I'm just going to get around 3 to 4 wraps. I generally like closer to 4 with this stuff, but just tie the fly based on what you kind of think looks good. I try not to count my wraps of materials while I'm tying, and just tie based on what point of that brush looks the best after I finish the pattern. So caught that on the bottom. Now I can go ahead and remove that, being careful not to cut your legs or your thread. And then I'll just grab everything with my left hand, pull back. And at this point you'll notice I have a little bit of that, I mean it's orange thread, so it's kind of looks like a carrot. That's that taper that you want to just help build the fly out a little bit nicer. The next material I'm going to go in with is a shrimp EP brush. This one is 3/4 of an inch, so the 0.75 wide, and I'm using the one in tan. I also, again, like this pattern a lot in olives, and we'll use the olive shrimp dub brush as well. And less is more with this stuff, guys. You want to really have that translucency to the pattern. So I'm going to tie that in and just let it hang backwards. We're actually just going to palmer that through as opposed to do touching turns to give that nice breathability and translucency to the pattern. Alright, we're almost there. So, ice dub, this is in the UV shrimp pink color. I'm going to go ahead and grab a little bit of that, and I like to dub a little bit at a time. If you try and dub too much at a time, it's so much harder to take dubbing away than it is to add, so not as important with saltwater stuff, but definitely if you're tying any smaller flies, it's a useful trick. So I'm going to dub that on, and we're just going to build up our body and move forward on that fly. Another simple trick that I see a lot of people actually doing wrong is when you're putting on dubbing, you want to make sure that you're only spinning in one direction. If you're rolling it on back and forth, you're never really making a tight dubbing ball. If you spin in one direction though, all of those fibers are going to continuously lock, and it allows you to control the amount of fluff you get in the end. We're also going to go back through with this with a dubbing brush and really pick it out. Velcro on a popsicle stick works great though. So I'm spinning that on in one direction, and I'm just trying to get those thread wraps covered. Tighten up a little bit. Last little bit of dubbing just to get us up to the eyes. Alright, and right there is good. So I'll get a couple thread wraps in just to make sure my thread is secure up at the front of the fly, just behind the eyes. And at this point, we're going to go in with our dubbing brush and just lightly pick it out. We're also going to go in again one more time, but if we don't lightly pick it out now, we're not going to get as much of that shrimp pink out. So at this point, I'm going to handle this just like a hackle. I'm going to try and preen the fibers backwards by pinching and pulling and getting the left and right side fibers to all face backwards. And I'm going to start with one turn right at the base of all of that flash, right where we tied this brush in. And then I'm going to start to just open up a little bit. I'm going to allow for some spacing as I wrap that forward, and you're trying to get around 5 wraps of this up the body. Just try and keep it nice and even. You can space them farther apart to make a more sparse pattern, but you can go narrower if you want to make it a little bit heavier dressed fly. But just try and keep them even. And then when you get right behind the eyes, I'll actually tie in a couple extra wraps. So I try to get 2 right on top of each other, right behind the eyes, just to give a little bit more of a veil. I'm going to catch that on the underside of the hook. Boom. 2, 3. Wraps over. Then I'm going to fold it backwards. 1, 2, to make sure that it's really locked in. And then at this point, I won't worry about trimming off that brush. I'm just going to go in and whip finish. Go ahead and remove my thread. Remove my brush. If you have a pair of bad scissors on your desk or like fingernail clippers or something, that's always better to cut away those brushes. They will dull out your scissors. And then I'm just going to start to kind of encourage those fibers out by picking them and then rolling them between my fingers. And at this point, I'm going to cut my legs. I like to cut all four at the same time. Just grab them by the tips. Don't pull super tight because they are elastic, they're rubber, and they'll just pull right back into the body. And I'm going to cut them just a little bit longer than the feelers. And then I'll grab my two Flashabou antenna and cut those about a 1/2 inch longer than my legs. Alright, that's it. That's the surf scrimp. Please tie some of these up. I would love to see and hear about any cool fish you get to eat this bug. If you need any help, feel free to call us over at Lost Coast Outfitters, and we're also going to have a package of all these materials available on our site that's going to be linked in the description below. Thanks again. Happy tying.